Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 395. And in our final lectures, we're going to examine some trends within California in the late 20th century. This class, American Studies 395, is a study of California in the 20th century. Many weeks ago, we began with a look at developments in the early 20th century, the Progressive Era. We have proceeded in the weeks following to examine major trends and developments within the 20th century. Here in our final weeks together, our final lectures, we're going to talk about California in the last few decades of the 20th century. And we begin that process here today with a look at the development of two key subcultures within California in the 1970s that have had a great impact on American culture more broadly in the late 20th and now 21st century. So in some ways, we are returning once again to one of the big themes in this class, how what developed in California serves to later define the broader story of the United States. We began with that theme very early on with the Progressive Era, as we saw how California was a hotbed of progressivism and how that later influenced trends that define the United States as a whole. And so in our final lectures, as we now turn our attention to the late 20th century, we'll see that once again, how what developed here within California would later influence the totality of the United States. Here we'll see that with the development of two key subcultures that come out of California in the 1970s, namely punk and skate cultures, and how they influence America broadly in ways we still see today in the 21st century. In the 1970s, the post-war expansion, that period in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s of relative affluence where the California and more broadly American economy was strong, where Americans with a high school diploma could find good-paying union jobs and buy a home and live the California dream, was coming to an abrupt end. And the economy of the 1970s would instead be marked by uncertainty, instability, and declining fortunes for middle-class Californians. We already examined that in our lecture on the rise of conservatism as one of the factors behind the success of Prop 13 in 1978, where Californians, feeling squeezed by a very different economy in the 1970s, would avidly embrace this argument for lower taxes, with all the consequences that came from Prop 13. So we've already talked about what's going on in the California and, more broadly, American economy in the 1970s in that previous lecture. Here we see it as the context for the rise of skate and punk. So in the 1970s, you had a very different economy than had prevailed in the 50s and 60s. Now America faced competition abroad. Now there were increasing energy costs with the oil boycotts of the early 1970s. Now factories were closing, moving overseas with the advent of deindustrialization, the end of that industrial economy where people had good-paying union jobs working in factories. The trends that drew people to California after World War II, the defense industry, with the jobs that came in aerospace, in defense contracting, the boom times of the 60s, where people were drawn to California because of the good-paying manufacturing jobs, the defense industry jobs that allowed you to buy a house in the sunny suburbs of California and live the California dream. That was increasingly coming to an end in the 1970s. Part of this was competition from abroad, the rise of Japan, Germany, nations that we warred against in World War II, but were key allies in the Cold War. We helped to rebuild. Well, by the 1970s, Germany and Japan were rebuilt. They were ascendant anew, and they became key competitors, as well as many other nations around the globe, as part of a trend of globalization. In 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, the United States imported more than it exported, a trade deficit. For most of the 20th century, the United States had been an exporter of manufactured goods, televisions, washing machines, automobiles, which we made here in California and around the nation and exported to the world. But now, beginning in the 1970s and certainly continuing through today, the cars we drive, the TVs we watch, the appliances in our homes, the clothes we wear, were increasingly made abroad, and that's part of a trend of deindustrialization, the loss of a manufacturing base which was vital to the post-war prosperity that defined the California dream. In 1960, 38% of the American workforce was employed in manufacturing. They went to jobs and factories, they turned bolts, they made tangible goods, automobiles. Manufacturing was a key part of the California economy. So many people worked at the Firestone plant in East Los Angeles making tires. So many people were turning bolts and building automobiles throughout California. But by 1980, that share of the workforce employed in manufacturing had dropped dramatically. And that would continue through the late 20th century as now America faced competition from abroad, as now many American corporations would move their operations overseas seeking cheap labor. And that has a ripple effect on the California and American economy. This development of deindustrialization, the end of an industrial economy, the end of an economy where people go to jobs and factories, make tangible goods, the rise instead of a service sector economy, where now, in the 21st century, most people don't make things. Whatever job you may have in the future, it probably will not involve going to a factory and producing some sort of tangible good. It's instead in the effort to provide services. That's what's happened since the 1970s, the rise of a service sector economy, where today Americans provide services in the now deindustrialized economy of the late 20th and 21st century. And the service sector economy tends to have two segments. There's the high end, accounting, law, medicine, where people provide services. Again, if you're an accountant or a financial advisor or a lawyer, you don't make something, you provide a service. But because your service required a college degree and is valued as such, it therefore is a job, a service sector job that's well rewarded, well compensated. The other side, though, the service sector economy, fast food, home health care, hospitality, baristas at Starbucks and greeters at Walmart, those are low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs. So what happens in California and nationwide in the 1970s is that factories close, lay off their workforce, and those without a college degree find themselves on the lower end of that service sector economy. So the era of affluence that prevailed in California most vibrantly, because as we've talked about in so many lectures recently examining post-World War II California, California was at the epicenter of that post-war boom. There were good-paying jobs in California, in the defense industry, in housing and construction and manufacturing. Well, that ends in the 1970s for all these reasons. Deindustrialization, competition from abroad, the ways in which the American and California middle class who had aspired to that California dream in the 50s and 60s found themselves increasingly squeezed by declining job opportunities, a new service sector economy that often locked them into low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs, rising prices for energy with the oil boycotts in the 1970s. So this was a great blow to the auto industry, as the big gas-guzzling cars that once defined the good life were now seen as liabilities. All of these trends, deindustrialization, the shift of manufacturing overseas, leads to a very different California economy in the 1970s, where that California dream increasingly seems to be precarious. I've mentioned many times throughout the slide that in the 1970s there are these oil boycotts where OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, most of them located in the Middle East, objecting to American foreign policy, namely our support for Israel, cut off the flow of oil. And this had profound impacts on the California and national economy. One, it led to increasing prices for gasoline. California was a state, an economy, a society so dependent on cars. It was the heart of the car culture of the post-World War II period. Well, because our economy, society, and culture was so dependent on cars, when gas prices skyrocket, it's a great blow, a great challenge to that California economy, society, and culture. It was a way of challenging the California dream of living in the suburbs, far away from your job in the city, which mandated long commutes and driving. The suburbs were the ideal, but living in the suburbs now increasingly was expensive because of these energy shocks. This was a great blow to the California auto industry. So many Californians in the post-World War II period either worked for Ford, GM, making cars and trucks, or benefited from the prominence of the auto industry within California. So when gas prices skyrocket in the 1970s, it has a concussive effect on the California economy. It leads to layoffs, it leads to factory closures, but also it has this great psychological impact because that California dream, which as we've talked about in recent lectures in many ways is the American dream of the post-World War II period, house in the suburbs, new car in the garage, annual trips to Disneyland. That California dream that was so car-centered now became a liability. That big sedan in the driveway doesn't symbolize a good life. It symbolizes a great drain on your pocketbooks. Living in the suburbs now is a detriment to the good life rather than a marker of the good life. So it's hard to overstate the impact of those oil shocks. In the 1970s, a new word entered the American vocabulary, stagflation, a hybrid of the word stagnant, referring to the stagnant, no-growth economy of the 1970s, and inflation. Now, in Economics 101, you learn that in times of economic growth, you get inflation, a rise in prices. But in times of economic decline, you get a decline in prices. But in the 1970s, you had the worst of both worlds, where simultaneously the economy was stagnant, not expanding, not producing new jobs, owing to competition abroad, owing to deindustrialization, and at the same time rising prices owing to those energy shocks and oil boycotts. So you had this brand new word that entered the American vocabulary that was necessitated by this anomaly in economics where you had a stagnant economy and a lack of wage growth that really spoke to this new reality of economic hardship, stress, distress, and decline. Stagflation became the word to describe the new California and American economy that prevailed in the 1970s. With deindustrialization, with factories closing, laying off their workforce, it meant a decline in the tax base within many American and California cities. Now, we talked again in our lecture on conservatism about the effects of Prop 13. Prop 13 comes out of, in many ways, this new economy of the 1970s, where California taxpayers avidly embraced cutting taxes because they felt that their family budgets were increasingly squeezed owing to all these trends of the new economy of the 1970s. And so Prop 13 passes, and that leads to declining tax revenues for the state of California with all the effects we talked about in that lecture, the new era of budget deficits, declining revenue, and therefore less money for funding education, ever-increasing fees at the Cal State and UC system. But another factor in the declining tax revenues for California was deindustrialization, the decline in the California economy. And this meant less money not only for education, but for police forces, for social services. And so in urban areas in California, as well as around the nation, there was this sense of malaise that came with cities that no longer functioned and worked because they couldn't fund the city services that made these cities once functional and emblems of the modern experience within California and around the nation. Now, one of the consequences of the declining fortunes for many California cities and cities around the nation with deindustrialization was an exodus of people to what's known as the Sun Belt, states of the Southwest like Arizona, New Mexico, and the American South. And this played a key role in the greater prominence and power of conservatism nationwide. What began here in California in the efforts of Richard Nixon and others, again, eventually became a national movement, the rise of the modern conservative movement. And as people moved to southwestern states like Arizona and to southern states, fleeing urban areas in the north and sometimes in California, it increased the population of those states, increased their political clout, increased their representation in Congress and the U.S. House and their electoral votes. And that has played a key role in the greater power that conservatives have had in national politics in the late 20th century. So a lot of people looking at urban America, both the large cities in California and around the nation, and seeing declining fortunes and dysfunctional cities that can't be funded in the way they once were, would move to southwestern states, move to southern states. A lot of foreign car companies eventually established themselves in states like Tennessee, because Tennessee has very strict laws regarding unionization, preventing automobile workers from unionizing. And so Toyota and Honda set up their factories in Tennessee, drawn to those states because they could pay their workers so little. And therefore, people now move to Tennessee to work in the car industry. And that augments and expands the power of conservative states like Tennessee in the American South and in the Southwest, helping to further fuel an exodus out of California and many urban areas, as well as expand the power of conservatives. So beginning in the 1970s, you have what we now recognize as the new American economy, where you have this great cleavage, this great divide between haves and have-nots. Declining fortunes for those without a college degree who find themselves working in low pay, low prestige, no benefit jobs in fast food, retail, home health care, hospitality. And what that has meant is a decline in wages, real wages, adjusted for inflation, meaning that middle-class Americans had more buying power in the 1970s than they do today, because adjusted for inflation, their wages went further. What we have seen since the 1970s is a decline in wages for working class and middle class Americans, adjusted for inflation, and ever-increasing housing costs, ever-increasing educational costs, ever-increasing healthcare costs, the things that define a middle-class lifestyle, a house in the suburbs, the ability to send your kids to college, affordable healthcare, have increased in price. That house in the suburbs in California that in 1978 cost $50,000 to buy now costs $900,000 to buy. At the same time, the wages that we earn have not increased. And that tells you a lot about America, California, in the last few decades. The frustration that has often fueled political movements based on tapping into anger, resentment, a sense that the California dream and the American dream is in decline. Because today, Californians and Americans earn less, adjusted for inflation, than they did in the 1970s, and yet everything costs more. So this is the new reality in the late 20th century, the new American economy, this new economy we've seen develop today of a great cleavage between haves and have-nots, this great divorce between those with a college degree and those who do not, the rise of billionaires and others, while so many Americans find themselves slipping behind. And here in California, the pain and trauma of that was particularly acute because in the 50s, 60s, and even into the early 70s, the California dream seemed to be so accessible and people flocked to the state in the ways that we've talked about. Where, again, someone without a college degree could buy a house in the suburbs, send their kids to the expanded CSU and UC systems that were then free to attend and the pride of the nation. But since the 70s, that economy has shifted, and we have seen this great divide between haves and have-nots. In the 1970s, the response to this new economy was often one of anger and frustration. One of the more popular films produced by Hollywood in the 1970s was Network, and it's a very fascinating film to watch today because it so presages the media culture of the 21st century, cable news, the sensationalism that has prevailed in terms of reporting the news rather than the substance of the news. This is a film about a TV anchor who leads a crusade of anger and frustration. He goes on the air and urges the American people to go to their windows, open their windows, and say, "I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." And he becomes this great sensation on television for leading this crusade of anger. And a lot of Californians, a lot of Americans in the 1970s, who came up in an age of affluence in the 50s and 60s and now saw this very different economy, were angry and frustrated. Here in California, there was a local program produced in Los Angeles that eventually became a syndicated nationwide program, hosted by David Horowitz. David Horowitz was a very prominent figure within local media here in Los Angeles. He was a news anchor for many decades. He became very famous because in the late 20th century, 1990s, there was an incident in Los Angeles where an armed gunman broke into the studio where Horowitz did the afternoon local news and made him read this manifesto live on the air. And Horowitz really sort of kept his wits and didn't panic, and he read this manifesto. And so when the story broke, he became sort of the face of local LA news because he was so calm in the response to this armed gunman, himself demonstrative of the anger and violence of that period. When this armed gunman broke into the local TV news station and made Horowitz read this live on air, he was sort of unflappable, so became very famous as a result. But before that, he was the host of what ultimately became a nationally syndicated TV show called Fight Back and Don't Get Ripped Off, where he would challenge commercials, images in marketing that made claims about products and see whether or not those products held up to those claims. There's a very famous incident where Igloo Coolers, the manufacturer of coolers, in the 1980s had a TV spot where an elephant stood on their coolers. And the whole idea was their coolers are tough. They could stand up to the weight of an elephant. And so in the Burbank TV studios where Fight Back was filmed, Horowitz took these Igloo coolers and had an elephant from the LA Zoo come and stand on them and test whether or not they really stood up to these claims. So Fight Back was about challenging the marketing and advertising of American products and empowering consumers. But it often had a tone of conspiracy, that they're out to get you, that they want to rip you off, that the only thing you could do is fight back. And so this TV program that began as a local program produced here in Los Angeles eventually became a nationally syndicated show because it appealed to that anger and frustration that businesses, corporations, marketers are trying to rip you off, and you need to get angry and get mad and fight back. Another one of the responses to the new economy here in California in the 1970s was, again, support for the conservative movement. Point we made in that lecture a few weeks ago about how the 1970s, though we often think of it as a more libertine age of disco, the porno chic era, where Americans are going to see Deep Throat as part of a more sexually liberalized era. We have to think of the 1970s as an era of feminism and gay rights, and certainly that's part of the 1970s, but the 1970s was a very conservative era. It was the era where Richard Nixon is reelected in a landslide in 1972, 49 states to 1. It's a period of rising cultural conservatism, televangelists, mega churches that would see Orange County and Southern California as really the epicenter of that more evangelical, born-again Christian movement, as we read about in the Ariano book. So we need to strip ourselves of a lot of stereotypes of the 1970s that we associate with disco and roller skating and more libertine attitudes about gender and sex, and rightfully see it as a very conservative period. And certainly that's true in California, when California's own Richard Nixon is reelected 49 states to 1 in 1972 to the White House, where Ronald Reagan is governor and will soon make his own bid for the White House. So California was a very conservative place in the 1970s. And you see that with the great gains the Republican Party makes here in California in the 1970s with the success of Prop 13. That's because their message of lower taxes, less regulation, more drilling, and expanding oil and energy production was very appealing to Californians who were now living in this post-industrial era, this post-industrial decline, where the California dream seemed to be so outside their grasp. Another response that helps us now shift towards the development of skate and punk cultures here in California 1970s. Another response to the declining fortunes of the California dream and the California middle class 1970s was to turn inward and reject a more societal we sensibility that had prevailed in the 1960s amidst civil rights, the counterculture. The 1960s was a we moment where people banded together, launched social movements to end the war in Vietnam, to advocate for the rights of minorities. This is the story that we saw earlier in Cesar Chavez and AIM and the occupation of Alcatraz. So the 1960s was a time of social movements where people banded together and wanted to change California, change America. But the 1970s was a very individualistic era where people became very suspicious of mass movements and often embraced this much more antagonistic, inward-looking, individualistic streak. The novelist Tom Wolfe described the 1970s as the me decade, by which he meant that in this period, we abandoned a lot of the we sensibilities of the 60s that fueled social movements and turned inward, and tried to find meaning and direction in this new America of the 1970s, amidst this new economy of the 1970s, where what had once seemed like a period of stability, security, where anyone could achieve the California dream, had now turned out to be a lie. And so Americans and Californians went searching for meaning in the 1970s that often urged them in a way towards a more individualistic streak. And so fads like physical fitness, self-development, TM, transcendental meditation, where harried suburbanites would go off into their living rooms and contemplate their place in the world. Fads like pet rocks and disco and roller skating became central to the culture of California 1970s and demonstrative of the more individualistic point of view of this period, where the emphasis wasn't on big social movements to change California, change America, accomplish justice and equality, but instead self-development, self-focus, individualism, making this a me decade. In 1979, the cultural critic Christopher Lasch reflected on the culture of the 1970s with his landmark study, The Culture of Narcissism, where he charged Americans with being narcissistic, too focused on themselves, very suspicious of the broader society and social movements, stylizing their existence through individual pursuits by being increasingly cynical and ironic about the larger society, finding meaning in their lives through this very self-centered, narcissistic personality that was now very critical of the idea of social movements, of harmony, of working together to accomplish something on a large scale. Instead, make fun of such movements. Everything is ironic. Everything is subject to skewering and criticism. Instead, focus on yourself and individualism, culture of narcissism. So, in the 1970s, whether it's the spirit of network, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, the individualistic, antagonistic point of view of shows like Fight Back and Don't Get Ripped Off, the rise of a conservative movement that emphasized individualism, was critical of institutions, government, argued that we need to lower taxes because all your tax money is just wasted on ineffective social programs anyways. That led to a dog-eat-dog, individualistic, everyone out for themselves mentality. Focus on individualism, self-development, and ironic detachment, as Lash described it, where you are increasingly cynical of others. It was a time where the California dream now seemed to be a lie. And as a result, the institutions, the social fabrics that defined the post-World War II period were now subject to a lot of backlash. It was a time where people felt hopeless, restless, angry, restive, and as we'll see, that deeply influenced the subcultures that developed in California in the 1970s and then later spread because so many Americans shared that sense of restlessness, hopelessness, and frustration. First of the two subcultures we discuss in this lecture that developed in California out of this context that we've now described: deindustrialization, the decline of the California middle class, the culture of individualism. The first of the subcultures that comes out of that stew, out of that soup that we've now described, skateboarding. It is a subculture that develops among young people in Southern California in the 1970s that was very critical of the world their parents made, that was very rebellious, that was very much a product of a California that now seemed to no longer offer hope, direction, and a good life. One of the epicenters for the skateboarding culture of the 1970s was Venice, California, right here in Los Angeles. And in the 1970s, Venice was so demonstrative of this post-industrial decline. It was a city that really represented the end of the California dream. It was a city right there on the California coast, a beach city that in the mid-20th century had thrived as a tourist spot. Abbott Kinney came to that region in Los Angeles in the early 20th century. He helped build the Venice canals, trying to replicate Venice, Italy, in Southern California. So the city sort of developed in the early 20th century as sort of a quixotic dream. It was very demonstrative of the way in which California could be a place where your dreams come true, where someone could do something so foolish, ambitious, quixotic as building the Venice canals way off in California. But by the 70s, owing to trends we've talked about here, deindustrialization, the declining middle class, Venice was in decline. People were losing their homes. Homes were being foreclosed, abandoned. People had moved out of Venice, going to the exurbs and suburbs as freeways allowed people to now live in far-flung parts of LA County. Venice as a tourist destination now faced competition from Disneyland and other more modern post-World War II emblems of leisure in Southern California. In 1965, KNXT News, a local news service broadcast, did a series of stories on Venice, and they described it as Appalachia by the sea. Now, Appalachia, that region in the American South, had in the 1960s become a synonym for poverty. In the early 1960s, the sociologist Michael Harrington published a book called The Other America, which was this great expose of poverty. It was an act of journalism designed to shock the nation and showed that even in that period of relative affluence of the early 60s, there were so many Americans who were still impoverished. And it led to the war on poverty in the 1960s, the battery of programs that Lyndon Johnson advanced, like Head Start and Medicare, that were designed to help the poorest Americans in the richest nation on earth. So Appalachia, as a result of Harrington's studies, the resulting concern about those who were left behind, even in an era of affluence, Appalachia, which was the center of Harrington's study, became a metaphor, synonym for poverty. And now that term was being used to apply to what was once a sunny resort town in Southern California, Venice, Appalachia by the sea. In the KNXT news segments, they described Venice as a pocket of poverty with congested and dilapidated housing, a population where 1/3 of the families earn less than $4,000 a year. So Venice, where the skateboarding and punk cultures developed, was so demonstrative of a California dream in decline. This resort leisure town that developed in the mid 20th century that so represented the beach culture, the sunny Southern California ideal, had turned into a place of poverty that would be dubbed Appalachia by the sea. One key figure in the rise of the skateboard culture that comes out of that Venice was Tony Alva, who was key to fueling the skateboarding trend of the 1970s. Now, skateboarding had been around for most of the 20th century, and in the 1950s there were magazines and other expressions in American culture about this Southern California fad of skateboarding. But the modern skateboarding movement really developed in the 1970s, and Alva and others were key to it. He became a skateboard champion and became well known within that subculture for his success in a number of competitions. That led to interviews with Alva in skateboarding magazines. A lot of interest in this rebound, this renaissance of skateboarding since its early heyday in the 1950s. And in these interviews, Alva so represents that sort of individualism and also cynicism that prevailed in the me decade of the 1970s. He has a sort of, everyone out for themselves, individualism, dog-eat-dog mentality. The world our parents had made had turned out to be ultimately one of false hopes. He lived in Venice in the 1970s. He saw the declining fortunes of Californians. He skateboarded in abandoned swimming pools in homes that had been lost to foreclosure. And that created in him what he described as a make-it-now mentality. Everyone out for themselves. I'm going to become famous. I'm going to skate. I'm going to make money because it's a dog-eat-dog world. So for Alva, this became a means of economic survival in a California where the idea of now getting a job and going every day to a factory, turning bolts, earning a good union wage seemed to be fanciful. Everyone's out for themselves. Eventually, he tired of the skateboard competition culture and tradition that had made him so well known within the community. And he tired of that performance because he wanted to sort of be free of the confines of competition and sort of develop his own style and his own bravado. And that led him to commercializing that image of himself as sort of the rebel, young youth figure of the 1970s. He formed his own skateboard company, Alva Skates. And in the marketing and advertising, again, it was this emphasis on sort of an aggressive, young, rebellious, anti-authority spirit that made skateboarding very appealing to Californians and Americans who were wrapped up in these trends of the 1970s, where so much was in flux. What had once been a stable middle-class existence now seemed to be evaporating, where there was this sort of me individualistic field of expression developing now as something to anchor your life within. Alva Skates emphasized physicality, the skateboarding culture as one of great physical prowess as they turned these tricks and performed. These were young men, muscular, without their shirts on in the California sun. So it was about physicality, sexuality, style, aggression for a lot of young people, particularly young men, who felt very restive and hopeless and despondent in this post-industrial decline. So here was the subculture that tapped into that. Anger, apathy, individualism, in the form of this very magnanimous and charismatic figure, Tony Alva. As we'll talk about in a moment, there was a very successful documentary about the Venice subculture, skating subculture, released now some time ago called Dogtown. And you can watch this. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this lecture and Tony Alva and skateboarding at all, it's a wonderful documentary. One, because it gives you the whole background and story more than this lecture can about skating. But also it's this remarkable documentary of what Venice looked like in the 1970s. And you see the spray paint and the drained swimming pools and the grittiness of Venice. Today Venice has gentrified and it's, this kind of exclusive address, and, middle class people can't afford to live in Venice now. It's a product of, again, what we talked about earlier, this great cleavage in the California American economy between a few who can afford to live in Venice and the declining fortunes of the middle class. So if you go to Venice today, it's prettified, it's clean, it's this domain of the very rich West Side Angelino. But in the 1970s, it's gritty, it's dirty, and you see that in Dogtown, this documentary. Also in that documentary, you see Tony Alva. He's sort of the main character, and he's interviewed in the 70s in the documentary footage that was later used. And you see his bravado, his style, and you could start to understand why that was so appealing to the disaffected youth in Los Angeles, in Venice, in the 1970s. One key element of the subculture of skateboarding in 1970s California, and one of the vehicles that made it later a national trend, was Skateboarder magazine. Now, as I said, in the 1950s, there was a lot of attention towards skateboarding. It was part of the celebration of California in American culture, as California was seen as this symbol of the good life. And so skateboarding was part of that trend of sunny California. Skateboarding magazines were popular in the 50s, but they sort of went away in the 60s. Come back in the 1970s, though, and this very different skate culture that developed. And if you look through Skateboarder magazine, 1970s, again, it's documentary evidence, much like Dogtown, the film, released many decades later. You see the gritty kind of streets of Los Angeles where these skateboarders would go out and practice their moves and basically skate across the city in decline. You see it right there. So the ads, the photos, the whole culture of skateboarding represented in the magazines of the 1970s speaks to what we're talking about here. You see urban decay. You see what is really one of the great metaphors for what we're stressing here, how the skateboarding culture of the 1970s represents a Californian decline. The graffiti-ridden drained swimming pool. Is there any greater symbol of the California lifestyle, the California dream, than the swimming pool? A swimming pool in your own backyard. In the post-World War II period, people moved out to the suburbs. They had large backyards. They were suspicious of public space and the privatized individualism of the 1950s. Your suburban home cut off from public space. Public space was desegregating in the 1950s and 1960s, mandated by changes in the civil rights era. So now public pools were places where whites would swim next to Latinos and Native Americans and African Americans. And so in sort of one element of white flight, they wanted to flee those areas of racial mixing and have their own private swimming pool. It was sunny Southern California. It was the good life. It was a house in the suburbs, a big backyard, your own swimming pool. So there's probably no other symbol more of the image of the California dream in the post-World War II period than the swimming pool. But in Skateboarder magazine, 1970s, in Dogtown, the documentary that features so much footage from this period, you see in Venice these abandoned homes where people have lost their jobs, they've lost their homes to foreclosure, and they've drained the swimming pools. And now the swimming pools are filled with graffiti and young skateboarders who are hopping the fence into someone's abandoned backyard and using that as the playground for their new field of expression. So there's probably no greater metaphor for what's happening in Venice and Southern California in the 1970s than the drained swimming pools of the post-war boom era that are now inhabited by this new subculture that comes out of this post-industrial economic decline of the 1970s. Also, again, Skateboarder magazine took off and helped fuel this movement because it was so consistent with me-decade narcissistic trends in the 1970s. Here was entire subculture about performance, expression, beauty, sexuality, physicality, aggression, a source of meaning, a source of direction, a source of inspiration in many ways, though a rather dire and bleak inspiration, amidst a California that no longer worked, a California dream that was in decline, a world that no longer made sense. That stability, security, that good life that once seemed to be at hand was now outside one's grasp. And here comes, out of that milieu of despair, these images of young people in Southern California skateboarding in a way that taps into people's yearning for expression, individualism amidst the me decade. So, point here is, skateboarding comes out of all these trends that defined California in the 1970s and then later becomes a major national movement in this period. Already, having discussed the origins of skate culture in Southern California in the 1970s and putting in the context of broad trends in that period, we now turn our attention to the other subculture that develops in this period, punk rock. There are many debates about the origins of punk rock. It's sort of like hip-hop. There's this sort of West Coast, East Coast clash, whether you see it as originating in the gritty underbelly of New York City in the 1970s, or whether you see it developing here in Southern California. I'm not going to weigh into that controversy. I'm not going to step my toe into that water. I don't know who gets credit for being the first punk band. I don't think it really matters much. We can say conclusively, though, that punk rock is developing simultaneously on the East Coast and here in Southern California, because it's coming out of that same broad trend sweeping through the whole of the nation this period, the sense of disillusionment and despair in a very different America of the 1970s. George Ruthenberg and Paul Bohm were students at a high school in West Los Angeles, not too far from Venice, not too far from where Tony Alva and others were inspiring the skate culture of that period. And they dropped out of that particular institution and coined new names for themselves, Darby Crash for Bohm and Pat Smear for George Ruthenberg, and they formed one of the very first punk bands here in Southern California, the Germs. They joined with two other members who took the names Lorna Doom and Donna Rhea, and they formed this band called the Germs, which was one of the very first prominent punk bands in the whole of the United States, and certainly here in Southern California. And they couldn't play very well. Their music was very bad in terms of if you hold them to a standard of traditional musicianship. It was raw, it was angry, it was loud. They had this sort of swagger and bravado. They took these names that were open jokes like Pat Smear or Donna Rhea, and they performed this music that really spoke to the rebellious, restive sensibility of Southern Californians in the 1970s, in the exact same moment, in the exact same geography of the rise of skate. So you have, at the same time, the same location, coming out of Southern California, the same trends, the origins of the punk sound that was sort of anti-music, that was sort of anti the sort of slick corporate record-produced sounds that were coming out of other parts of California in the 1970s. 1970s was a period of singer-songwriters, of mellow music, of what today is sometimes derisively or sometimes supportively referred to as yacht rock, the music of the Doobie Brothers and Christopher Cross and others, sort of that mellow kind of sound that appealed to also Angelenos and Californians and Americans who were harried and overwhelmed by the very difficult time in the 1970s. The 1970s was also the origins of punk, which tapped into the sensibilities of the 1970s in a different way by expressing anger, frustration, an anti-corporate, anti-big business, anti-recorded music sensibility. And so one key figure in this group, the So we've talked about some of the origins of punk rock and the punk culture in Southern California in the 1970s as demonstrated by the Germs. Let's talk about some of the similarities between this subculture and the other subculture we discussed in this lecture, skateboarding. Like skateboarding, there was this whole a creation of a community within punk. They were self-consciously creating themselves as separate from the mainstream. Their music was loud, aggressive. It was very different than the popular music of that period. It was created by these sort of rebellious types who had felt that institutions had failed them, whether it was in the economy or in education. Punk, like skateboarding, created its own institutions, its own magazines. It had its own physical places of meeting for a community to foster its hangouts, as punk rock became very popular in certain bars. So an entire community developed, which offered people meaning and direction amidst the malaise and miseries of the post-industrial era of economic distress and decline. It also shared with skateboarding emphasis on physicality, sexuality. In the 1970s, that was a big part of the me decade, the emphasis on self-development, namely development of one's body, oneself, free expression, including sexuality. That was one key part of what Wolf described as the me decade and what Lash dismissed as narcissism. The emphasis not on the societal body, but on one's physical body. And punk rockers often, performed shirtless. They performed in sleeveless T-shirts. So there's a lot of sexuality, physicality to their performance. Their music was bad, so they made up for it with acts of violence. They sort of flouted convention. Many of the germ shows involved them taking this very hostile, aggressive stand against the audience themselves, the very fans, throwing flour at the fans and cascading them in sticky flour. There were all kinds of performance elements of punk rock that were anarchic, that were making fun of music and performance, that often took an antagonistic and aggressive stance against the very people who are the patrons of the bar coming to see you and your fans. Another similarity between punk is where it developed, not just in Southern California, not just in Los Angeles in the 1970s, but in a certain neighborhood within Los Angeles. We saw Venice as the epicenter of skateboarding, Dogtown, as this city in decline. Well, punk developed in Hollywood in the 1970s. And Hollywood may have once been associated with glitz, glamour, movies, movie stars, the rich, the famous. But Hollywood, that area of Los Angeles in the 1970s, was anything but glitzy and glamorous. It was, again, an area in decline. It was a place of economic depression. It was a target for the disaffected runaways who were living on the streets. The Hollywood studios were losing money in the 1960s and 1970s, challenged by upstart independent films, making movies that weren't always successful because they weren't geared towards the more rebellious sensibilities of young people in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of territory in Hollywood that was once owned by the studios was abandoned. And so there were a lot of abandoned buildings in Hollywood, just like in Venice. One of the key places within Hollywood where punk was performed, appreciated, where this punk culture developed, the Whiskey, which is a famous landmark in Hollywood. That's where the Germs performed. So the epicenter of punk culture was Hollywood, a part of Southern California that was also in decline, economically depressed, a window into the sort of disaffected sensibilities of young people who came of age in a very different California of the 1970s than the sunshine, halcyon days of the 50s and 60s. When California becomes one of the key originators, origin spots of punk, when the Germs and other bands begin to perform in Los Angeles, well, a lot of other young people in California travel to the Whiskey, travel to Hollywood to see these bands perform, and then they create their own bands. And Orange County became a big center of punk rock with many key founding figures, bands within the movement like Black Flag, Social D, Social Distortion. Orange County eventually became a key figure, place of punk culture because so many disaffected suburban kids growing up in a very different Orange County in the 1970s gravitated to Hollywood, which shares with Venice these attributes that made it sort of a crucible for these aggressive, rebellious, disaffected youth movements coming out of Southern California namely skate and punk. But what happens is that these subcultures that began as rebellious, as restive, as efforts by young people who were pushing against the decline of the California dream in a way that they could claim some space for individualism and expression. Well, what happens is that they eventually become mainstreamed and corporatized. Skateboarding goes big, and it becomes big business. It becomes co-opted by major corporations. ESPN airs the X Games. Skateboarders become millionaires and household names, Tony Hawk and others, who may have originated as these sort of young kids rebelling against convention, but eventually they themselves become part of this mainstreaming of skateboarding so that it becomes acceptable as part of, again, the dominant culture. Pat Smear, one of the founders of the Germs, will eventually join Nirvana, the acclaimed alternative rock band of the 1990s, which helped to bring that sound to MTV, mainstream America. And so a lot of what originated within Southern California as a counterculture eventually gets mainstreamed. And this is a big theme within American culture more broadly, where things that were once transgressive, rebellious, flouting, attacking convention eventually are brought into the dominant culture, whether it's rock and roll, hip hop, forces that initially appeared rebellious, transgressive, eventually do get co-opted by consumer capitalism and the dominant culture and then defanged of their transgressive sensibilities. And another factor in that is that America and California, beyond the 1970s, continued to be marked by a very unsteady economy. The trends that we talked about at the very beginning of this lecture, deindustrialization, the rise of a service sector economy, a fragile middle class, always fearful of falling behind, well, that's prevailed now into the 21st century. And so a lot of the factors that made skateboarding and punk appealing, the social fragmentation, the individualistic ethic, the sense of disillusionment and despair that came with the new economy that seemed to be working against the interest of middle class Americans, the anger, disillusionment, despair, craving for meaning that spawned skate and punk in the 1970s continued and has helped to also continue to fuel these movements that would develop in California, would emanate from California, and then later become part of mainstream American society. So here we've seen the development of two subcultures that eventually become mainstream cultures, two subcultures that originated in a certain moment in California in the 1970s that continue to dominate the totality of American culture, fitting with one of the big macro themes of this class. But again, the reason why these subcultures become dominant is that the origins of them, the disillusionment, despair, sense of fragility about the California American dream has continued in many ways now into the 21st century.